So it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. So we have Richard Halpern, who is a senior counsel with Gluckstein Lawyers. Richard is a leading national expert in medical negligence and birth injury litigation, no stranger to the people who usually attend our Risky Business Conference. Richard has over 30 years of experience interpreting medical science in legal contexts. And today's focus is evolving research on genetics and perinatal factors. The title of Richard's presentation, as you can see, is Scientific Causation and Birth Asphyxia, Cases, Autism Genetics, Placental Pathology, and the Role of Intrapartum Development. That's a mouthful. Welcome, Richard.
What a ridiculous title for a talk. A little bit of light stuff, we're going to talk about. Before I get into what I wanted to talk about, I just want to talk about what Brenda and Jen have done. All I can say is I just saw it for the first time. Wow. I think they've really gone above and beyond what any other law firm has ever even thought of doing. Clients come into my office, I look at their case, I prosecute the case, I get them a settlement, and I say goodbye. Maybe not that simple, but this is really impressive. So, congratulations to Brenda and Jen for doing this great work. Some of you who have attended Risky Business in the past have heard me talk about medical literature, scientific publications, and it's really a bit of an obsession with me. I'm going to talk about autism. I don't have any slides on placental pathology, but I'll touch on that as well. And it's a very focused, very technical talk. But I'd like you to take away some general thoughts as I go through things that are specific to autism. I would like you to take away some general thoughts. Why am I talking about autism? As will be familiar to everybody in this room, it's a diagnosis that is becoming more and more common. 3 times as many kids in the United States today are being diagnosed with autism compared to a couple of decades ago. So it's a very prominent diagnosis. We are seeing a lot of our young clients come in with a diagnosis of autism. And what we're concerned about is, do some kids have autism that's preventable? In other words, was that autism caused by something that went wrong during labor and delivery? That's what we're concerned about. And I approach the autism literature the way I approach all scientific literature, which I think we all must do, which is with a high degree of skepticism. And I think to me it's like, I don't know if you are consumers of U.S. politics like I am. I'm an obsessive consumer of U.S. politics. And everything I hear from CNN, I better hear the counterbalance from Fox, and I better do a gut check on all of it because none of it makes sense. We have to approach literature the same way. Does it make sense? What we see in literature, and I'm going to demonstrate this here a little bit, is that a lot of scientific literature, even in reputable publications, peer-reviewed scientific literature, is flawed. In other words, just because it's published in a peer-reviewed publication doesn't mean that it's good science in any field. And so we have to take those things and we have to approach them with this gut check to say, does it make sense? Does it work? What are the problems with literature? Well, part of it is that a lot of these studies are poorly designed, or the cohorts are too small, or they're too broad and they don't apply to your patient or your client. We have to think about these things. I'm reminded 20 years ago or 25 years ago, there was a guideline that came out from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Some of you may have heard me talk about this in the past, where they set out criteria that one must establish in order to make a connection between things that went wrong during labor and delivery and a bad neurological outcome for the child. And I went to an expert and I said, these criteria, they just don't make sense. And he said, I agree, but we're not going to be able to prove your case because this is the literature out there and the chances are that a court is going to accept it. And it was shocking to me. Well, I took the case that I had that didn't fit with this well-known published criteria, And I put it in a drawer, and I pulled it out 10 years later. And then we settled the case for $12.5 million 10 years later. Because the medicine had changed, or the understanding, the medicine never changed. The publication was wrong from the get-go, but the understanding about the medicine changed, and we were able to prosecute the case. So I think we have to approach all these things with a high degree of skepticism. So before I touch on autism, and what I anticipate with autism is that on the plaintiff side, we will claim that a diagnosis of autism can be attributed to medical negligence, and the defense will say, no, genetic, can't be avoided, it was inevitable. And we see the same thing being raised in some of our cases with respect to placental pathology. So I just want to, before I touch on autism, I just want to talk about placental pathology for a minute. As we know, the fetus relies on the placenta for the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the baby. The baby grows from a well-functioning placenta. The exchange of gases and nutrients between mother and baby occur through the placenta, and the return of carbon dioxide and waste products are transferred to mom for elimination. And adequate growth of the baby depends on a well-functioning placenta. In many of our cases, we have placentas that are not so well-functioning. We may have babies that are small, and that may be attributed to some dysfunction of the placenta. And what we encounter from time to time on the defense side is the assertion that, well, it wasn't what went wrong during labor and delivery that caused the neurologic injury suffered by your client, it was a dysfunctional placenta. And like literature on autism, and like literature on causation from intrapartum asphyxia, the literature is lacking. So there is no good data anywhere in the scientific literature about the role that a dysfunctional placenta plays in bringing about injury to a newborn. And this is something we have to be mindful of. First of all, the studies, as I say, with many studies, are poorly designed. Not all placentas are examined pathologically. The only placentas that are examined pathologically are those from bad outcomes. So we have to think about that, and then the effect of a dysfunctional placenta on the fetus is likely not to cause injury, which is what the defense will allege in a lot of our cases, but rather to make the baby more vulnerable to injury that requires a response by the obstetrical team. Which brings me actually to just another aside. I don't know how many of you read the New York Times, but in the New York Times last week, there was a lengthy article about the value of electronic fetal monitoring during labor and delivery. I don't know if any of you saw this article. But there's a lot of literature out there in the obstetrical community about diminishing the importance of measuring the baby's heart rate during labor and delivery as an indicator of fetal stress. A lot of literature out there diminishing the importance. And I think most of that literature is junk science, but it became prominent in a very one-sided article in the New York Times last week, promoting this notion that the only thing that monitoring the baby's heart rate does during labor is to increase the rate of cesarean sections, and that exposes mom to too much risk. It's just not true. Right? This is just not true. Prominent obstetricians cited for that, and very short shrift given to the opposite argument. But I can tell you by experience in our cases that there is no baby, no well-grown term baby who enters labor well oxygenated and who ends up being born depressed that will fail to tell the obstetrical care providers about it through changes in the fetal heart rate during labor. Never happens. Never happens. And often I wonder, when we look at this literature, I wonder whether the people who are creating this literature sometimes are motivated by an agenda other than the patient's well-being. And this is something else we have to, what are the ulterior motives? You may say, oh, well, Richard, you have an ulterior motive. You're suing the doctors, and you're going to charge a big fee, and you want to get paid, and that's your motive. I'm old enough that that's no longer my motive. So the fact is that unless these articles and these guidelines and the literature pay attention to patient safety as the only concern, and not the avoidance of accountability for lawsuits as a concern, only then will that literature be reliable. In January, I'm giving a talk at Mount Sinai about 3 or 4 flawed guidelines in obstetrics, why they're flawed and why change is needed. So this is an ongoing problem. So let me talk about autism a little bit. So part of the problem with autism is that it is a spectrum of disorders. And so it catches a lot of kids in the diagnosis. And then the literature tells us that it is not attributed to any single etiology or cause necessarily. So the things that figure prominently in a diagnosis of autism include genetics. There may be a genetic predisposition, prenatal factors, so we're talking about maternal health and things that occur before labor and delivery, perinatal factors, so those are factors that occur at and around the time of birth, and environmental factors, which really relate to oxygenation in a lot of these cases. Oh, and junk, fake news, Tylenol. There is no evidence of a causal connection between Tylenol and autism. I think wasn't it yesterday that they changed the label on Tylenol as to add a warning, I think, about this, which is, it's outrageous, really. Nothing short of outrageous. So I'm concerned about living in this post-truth society where the truth and evidence doesn't matter anymore. But anyway, I sort of betray my political views. So part of the problem with identifying a cause for autism is these problems in the studies. There are variations in methodologies. Some are very poorly designed. They make assumptions about a patient cohort that may not work. And some of the studies try to tease out whether peripartum events, so when I say peripartum, that means anything that occurs at or around the time of labor, so close to the time of labor, during labor, shortly after labor, any peripartum risk factors cause or contribute to autism. Now, most of the studies, or many of the studies, will tell us that there is a connection between peripartum complications and autism. But what we can't tell from the studies is which peripartum complications are more closely associated with the diagnosis of autism. And the reason we can't is because of the poor design of these studies. Nobody has defined what peripartum factors are being looked at. Now, in the second bullet, where our concern is with difficult labors, fetal heart rate patterns that deviate from normal, abnormal uterine activity, and most critically, neonatal evidence of acute brain lesions, both white matter injury and basal ganglia injury. So let me just pause for a moment and say there are broadly 2 populations of kids with autism. Some of those kids have no evidence of lesions on their brain on MRI, none, but still have autism. And some kids do have lesions on their brain. Now, we know in the context of birth trauma cases that kids who are exposed to a prolonged period of hypoxic ischemic insults during labor and are born depressed will demonstrate injury in the white matter of the brain, called a watershed injury, we know that. And some of those kids will go on to have a diagnosis of autism, amongst other things. They may have cerebral palsy, they may not. They may not. They may have intellectual challenges, cognitive challenges, normal motor function, and they may be diagnosed with autism. Some kids who are exposed to a more sudden and profound interruption of oxygenation will suffer injury to the basal ganglia thalami area, the deep gray matter of the brain. And some of those kids will go on to have a diagnosis of autism. And those kids are to be distinguished from kids without lesions on their brain. And so what does it tell you? We know that these white matter injury and the basal ganglia injury are injuries that are associated with asphyxia during labor and delivery. We know that to be the case. We can tell that. And if that's the case and these kids have autism, is their autism diagnosis due to a genetic cause, or might it be attributed to the lesions on their brain? And that's an important, I think, an important distinction. So where you do have positive neuroradiological findings and you have a diagnosis of autism following a traumatic birth, it would be reasonable to attribute the autism, it's usually not the only diagnosis, the autism to asphyxia. And that presumes an accurate diagnosis of autism, which is another issue. Okay, so here's part of the third bullet here demonstrates the flaws in the literature. And I give an example. For example, cesarean delivery is cited as a factor that increases the risk of autism. Now, the problem is that there's no reason to believe that there's anything about cesarean delivery that increases the risk of autism or the risk of injury. That doesn't make sense. Just think about it. What would it be about a cesarean delivery that would trigger a diagnosis of autism? Just use common sense. Nothing. It's what precedes the cesarean delivery that gives rise to the need for a cesarean delivery. And what is that? Well, that's some sort of an emergency. Right? We don't, apart from occasional elective cesarean deliveries for various reasons, physicians during labor do not do cesarean deliveries unless a problem arises. It's going to be maternal or it's going to be fetal, but a problem arises. So these studies that might find a correlation between cesarean delivery and autism are nonsensical. They haven't thought it through. Something preceded the need for the cesarean section. So this is the problem with these studies. They're not teasing out what events that occur during labor and delivery are events that might contribute to injury that manifests in form of autism. Universally, the literature says that the pathogenesis of autism remains unclear. In most cases, they say it remains elusive. And I'm saying in these cases where you actually see these white matter injury or a basal ganglia injury, it's not elusive at all. And even if you can demonstrate that a genetic factor played a role in autism, or even if you suspect that a genetic factor played a role in autism, it doesn't mean that it excludes other causes. Remember, a medical condition or a diagnosis may be triggered by multiple causes. There's often more than one cause. And there's good reason to believe that even if a child was predisposed because of a genetic problem to autism, that child may nevertheless not get autism. There are many kids who have these genetic changes, these deviations in their genes, who don't get autism. So there are kids whose autism is triggered by some environmental effect, and then it may be that autism is made worse by some event like asphyxia. So we have to keep those things in mind. So when I talk about asphyxia as a trigger, and I say this, I use this necessary element of a sufficient set only to demonstrate that genetics and asphyxia or other things can work together, each playing a role in creating the disability. This also comes from the literature. So we're talking about oxidative stress here as a cause, and again, we have to bring into this discussion perinatal complications as a cause for oxidative stress. I mean, that's the way these kids get injury to their brains, is through impaired gas exchange between mom and baby. So I say here in the fourth bullet, I say presumably genetic alterations do not cause biomarkers. Now, so what's a biomarker? Let's talk about what a biomarker is first. Kids who are asphyxiated will have abnormal gases, will have elevated lactate, will have elevated creatinine representing kidney dysfunction, will have elevated liver enzymes representing insults to the liver. These are all biomarkers. May even be hypoglycemia as another incident. And I'm suggesting that do genetic predispositions cause disruptions or disturbances in these biomarkers, or is it asphyxia that causes these things? There is some literature that suggests that when you have a genetic predisposition, you may be more likely to have a disturbance to the biomarkers, but it's far more likely that asphyxia causes these things. I think this is important too. If you take a careful look at the literature, you won't find any literature that definitively attributes autism to any one of the identified potential causes. And the important, when the defense in our cases raises the issue of autism as genetic, the studies of twins I think is very, very important, because with monozygotic twins, not every monozygotic twin who has autism will have the sibling have autism as well. So what that means is that it can't be entirely genetic, or you would expect that every pair of monozygotic twins would have autism. The fact that that does not occur has satisfied all researchers that one cannot attribute autism solely to genetics. Can't do it. And then when dizygotic twins, it's even less common for both twins to be diagnosed with autism. And I think that's a very important factor. And it's because of that the research has looked into environmental factors as either an independent cause of autism, or at least a contributing cause that may work with genetic predisposition to cause autism. And then autism may develop, according to the science, in utero, or it may not develop until early childhood. Okay, so I think this is just restating what I have already said about there being multiple causes for these conditions. But there are also studies that have found no association between perinatal asphyxia and autism. So the studies go both ways, but one should not take from that, or one should not conclude from that because there are studies that have not found a causal link between perinatal events and autism, that perinatal events don't cause autism. That's a logical fallacy. We ought not to take that as our assumption. So, and part of the problem is study design. Right? This is where I come back to study design. You do not have any robust studies that are able to, or are designed to tease out specific perinatal complications that might or might not be associated with autism. We just don't have those studies that are available to us. But it is no coincidence, and it's reasonable to infer that because monozygotic twins don't always both have autism, and because the incidence of autism is higher in kids exposed to perinatal stress, that there's a causal connection between perinatal stress and the diagnosis of autism. I hope that makes sense. Now, the studies have found that there is a connection between neonatal seizures and an increased risk of autism by a factor of 7, which is obviously significant. But what these studies don't ask is what causes the seizures, and that's what you have to ask. Many kids who seize, particularly kids who seize in the first 24 hours of life, seize because of either an asphyxial injury or perhaps stroke, or those are probably the two main reasons why kids seize in the first 24 hours of life. Virtually every newborn exposed to sufficient intrapartum stress to cause asphyxial injury will seize within the first 24 hours of life, often 6 to 8 hours of life, sometimes a little after 24 hours of life, virtually every single one. And then for those kids who are imaged through either head ultrasound or MRI, and where it is found to be an evolving brain injury in the first, say, week of life, where those kids seize, they're asphyxia-related seizures. And so if there's a connection between seizures and autism, the role that peripartum stress plays in causing that needs to be recognized. These are unanswered questions, but I pose them to you. Can autism be caused independently by perinatal factors, or must there be a predisposition? It's a very broad diagnosis. We'll talk about that in a second. Will perinatal factors only increase the severity in the clinical presentation? In other words, if you have a genetic disposition, are you doomed to the diagnosis, but it could be worse? And I talk about twins again, but we've talked about that already. So, I mean, this was getting into the weeds a little bit, this was an interesting study because it looked at probands. So probands are the first person in a family to be identified with a genetic disorder, and their unaffected siblings, and then they had a control group. And incidentally, in all this literature, the problem with getting reliable literature is you often can't get control groups, and the heterogeneity of cohorts is just too broad. But in this situation, where you had an affected sibling, and then you have unaffected siblings, it found that that unaffected siblings had higher frequencies of prenatal and perinatal factors than did the control group. So what does that tell us? It says you have the elder of the children, the siblings, is diagnosed with autism. Then you have a sibling who does not have autism, but they did have perinatal complications. So think about what conclusion you can draw from that. The older sibling has autism, the unaffected sibling does not, but they both had perinatal complications. Does it make logical sense that perinatal complications were enough to trigger the autism in the affected sibling? I think that's the conclusion that can be drawn from the study. And so there may be a genetic predisposition not only to autism, but there may be a genetic predisposition to perinatal complications. But not all kids who go through perinatal complications are diagnosed with autism, but some are. Some are. So there I talk about the severity of the symptoms and it differed. Now, what the study didn't look at is the severity of the perinatal stresses. Did the child with autism have a more traumatic birth than the child without autism? That might tell us something more, right? Because if you have two kids with the same genetic predisposition, but one has more labor stress than the other, and the one with more labor stress ends up with a diagnosis of autism, then is it reasonable to conclude that there's a relationship between the degree of perinatal stress and autism? So let me pause and talk about something I know about now, which is law. I know nothing about science. Let me talk about law for a second. When we prove causation in these cases, we don't have to prove causation with scientific precision. We don't have to prove a 95% confidence interval. At law, the burden of proof is a balance of probabilities or more likely than not. So we don't need scientific literature to establish what's called the ultimate question. Is there a link between the perinatal stress and the bad outcome? We don't need the scientists to tell us that. All we need to do is give enough evidence to suggest that there is a relationship between the perinatal stress and the diagnosis, and that it is permissible for a judge or a jury to make the link between perinatal stress and autism on the evidence. They can infer it only if they believe that it's more likely than not that there is that connection. So you don't have to have scientific literature that makes a definitive causal connection between perinatal stress and autism in order to succeed at trial. So I've talked a little bit about this, about the severity of the factors involved, which is something that the study is unable to tease out. No study is teased out. It does not tell us whether intervention took place for the unaffected sibling due to risk factors, and it didn't talk about brain lesions. So what's missing from most of these studies is an absence of an examination of the brains of all kids affected by autism. In other words, how do you know whether a brain lesion might affect the diagnosis? How do you know which kids with brain lesions have autism and which don't? It seems to me it's a very important factor, because you have these two groups where you may have a profound injury to the brain and autism, and where you have no injury to the brain and autism. And so these studies are deficient in this regard. We do not have definitive answers to the question on the connection between perinatal factors and autism. Okay, so on item 3 here, I mentioned this dose effect factor, so I think that this is important. The worse the stress, the more severe the autism. The worse the stress, the more severe the autism. But what this doesn't tell us is what the vulnerability of the baby was. This is assuming everything's equal. Same weight, same biometry, same gestational age, same everything, same cord gases, nothing about imaging. We don't know what we're comparing, and this is not apples to apples. So while common sense tells us that there's a dose effect, which makes complete sense, we don't know what that dose effect is, because again, we can't tease out dose as an independent factor and then measure the effect on these kids. And then I always ask this question, where is the neuroimaging? Why don't these studies include neuroimaging? Why don't they look at whether some kids have brain injury or not? There are some studies, I think I have a slide on this, there are some studies that suggest that there is some subtle white matter changes in many kids diagnosed with autism, but not all. So what role does genetic testing play in these cases? More and more frequently in our birth trauma cases, the defense seeks to have genetic testing of our kids, looking for a genetic cause to the outcome. It's now becoming very common. In fact, in many of our cases, as a preemptive measure, we do our own genetic testing privately before the defense ever raises it, because if there truly is a genetic cause, it's not a case that we want to pursue. If it's unpreventable, we can't help these folks. They've got to look to Jen and Brenda to get some help. So we can't help those folks if there's solely a genetic cause. But again, that's rare, because genetic abnormalities, deviations, have varying degrees of significance, clinical significance. And some variants are unimportant, and some variants are more important. But again, even where there's a genetic cause that may explain in our kids cerebral palsy most of the time, even if there's a genetic variant, it doesn't mean that there's no role for intrapartum complications in causing that cerebral palsy as well, something we need to think about. So this is another mystery about autism, I find, because first of all, it's a psychiatric diagnosis. I never really understood why it's a psychiatric diagnosis, but it is a psychiatric diagnosis. And there are physicians who will tell you that accuracy in diagnosing autism depends on a certain acquired skill. Not everybody who makes the diagnosis of autism has the necessary acquired skill to make the diagnosis, which I think is important. The current DSM issue is number 5, but number 4, between DSM-4 and DSM-5, the definition of autism actually changed quite significantly. So in the last 20 years, the prevalence of autism in the United States has tripled. That's a lot. There's been a dramatic increase in the last few decades, and I ask why. Is it because autism is more common? Is the diagnostic criteria wider? Is the diagnostic criteria now too wide, catching kids that actually don't have autism at all? And are there errors in making the diagnosis because there are overlapping pathologies? White matter injury, gray matter injury as an example, as an overlapping pathology where those kids may not have autism but share features similar to kids who do by virtue of their brain injury. And then other countries have had the same experience. You will not find an answer to any of these questions in the literature. It just doesn't exist. Nobody really knows what the answer is to this. So DSM-5 is a current clinical criteria for diagnosing autism. But these kids often have these co-occurring conditions, so it doesn't usually appear on its own. And these comorbidities, they think, so obesity and anxiety and epilepsy, may have a shared etiology. But be careful, because the shared etiology for obesity, anxiety, and epilepsy might not be autism, might be asphyxia. That might be the shared etiology. In other words, in what order do these things occur? If you have autism, are you more likely to be anxious and obese? If you have autism, are you more likely to have epilepsy? Well, it seems to me no. No, autism doesn't cause epilepsy. Or is the process that caused your epilepsy the reason why you have autism? These are the questions that we have to ask. So this paper says there's a strong association between moderate to severe NE and the development of autism. So let's talk about what's NE. NE is a neonatal encephalopathy. So NE brain sickness of the newborn is neonatal encephalopathy. You've heard the term today HIE, which is hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. And HIE is a subset of neonatal encephalopathy, and it's the subset that occurs at around the time of birth. So babies with brain sickness at around the time of birth have HIE, a form of neonatal encephalopathy. But this association that was found in this paper never considered brain lesions, which I say is one of the key missing components from much of the literature on autism. They didn't look at watershed injury, they didn't look at basal ganglia injury, they didn't look at mixed injury. Some kids have both white matter and basal ganglia affected. Okay. So this is what I was talking about. There are some studies that do suggest that there are some white matter changes in many of the kids who have autism, but they don't describe whether there's an overlap between those white matter changes and what we see in asphyxia cases. In asphyxia cases, when kids have white matter injury, it's bilateral, it's on both sides of the brain, it's a watershed region, it's extensive, and it's diffuse. There's no study that tells us about the white matter injury that kids with autism have, whether it's bilateral, whether it's diffuse, whether it's extensive, and what distribution it's in. So we can't compare these things. One of the reasons why they think that there might be language impairment is because of this white matter involvement. But again, they haven't considered why the white matter connectivity has been affected. And again, as I said, they don't look at this diffuse bilateral injury that we know is caused by asphyxia. So what happens to these kids? We have to think about when we're looking at these cases, we have to think about how the brain gets injured. What's the mechanism of injury? How does that happen? And in asphyxia cases, and the reason why we see diffuse injury, and the reason why we see it on both sides of the brain, is because during labor, when these kids are asphyxiated, their cardiac output is reduced after a certain period of time of being exposed to hypoxic insults. Their cardiac output is reduced. That causes hypotension in the baby. That causes lower blood pressure, so less oxygenated blood perfusing to the brain from its source. That's why it's bilateral, and that's why it's diffuse. Now, if you see this injury in a kid, an injury that you could attribute to fetal hypotension, then why would you think that that brain injury is attributed to anything but asphyxia? Autism doesn't cause fetal hypotension. It just doesn't cause it. So we have to think about the mechanism by which these kids get injured if we're going to attribute disability to a particular cause. Okay, way too much. Okay. It's way too much already, right? So way too much. Okay, so what can we do for our clients as a result of what we know about the medicine? Well, why is it important that we know anything about the medicine as lawyers? I've been talking for 40 minutes about something I'm not qualified to talk about, but it just seems to me that when these families walk in the door and they inevitably ask, what happened to my baby, which is usually the first question, an unanswered question, unfortunately for most of them, when they come through the door, we've got to be able to identify the issues, tease out the issues for them, so that we know the questions to ask of our experts. That's the only reason why lawyers should jump into medicine like this, is because if we're really going to advocate for our clients, we need to understand the medicine so we know what questions to ask of our experts, number one. And number two, when we get feedback from our experts, we have to be able to test what they tell us. if I'm going to encourage my client to go down the long road of litigation, I want to be in a position to say to my client, you know, I think there's a pretty good prospect of success. I've questioned my expert. I've tested what they have to say. It's something that we can rely on to expose you to what is a second insult that Dr. McGregor is going to talk to us about this afternoon. So we have to be satisfied that as lawyers, as advocates for these children, that we understand what the questions are, what the issues are, that we've tested our experts to make sure they do too, that they haven't missed anything, and that we can, with confidence, say to our clients, you know what, this is a case that ought to be pursued. At the same time, we should not be telling clients not to pursue cases unless we've done the same inquiry, the same investigation, unless we understand why the case may not have merit, why there may be a reason to attribute autism to something unrelated to mismanagement of care, say a genetic cause as an example. That's why we may do genetic testing preemptively in these cases to satisfy ourselves on that issue. So I apologize, we're a little early, and I apologize for such a dense talk, but Charles.
When you talk about the preemptive genetic testing and disqualifying cases, it seems that if we can get research for autism cases that would show, and I know the research isn't there yet, that genetic predisposition plus some perinatal factors is, instead of may cause, but does cause, then you would have the science to proceed, and then it would be more like a thin skull kind of case where you argue your case to say, well, yeah, there is genetics, but it's because of these perinatal issues that we're negligent for during the time that, you know, as a thin skull, they put them over and cause the autism because you can see with the twin, they didn't get it. Is that kind of where this needs to go before these autistic cases become actionable?
Well, I think it's already there, but let's talk. So a thin skull, it means you take your victim as you find him or her. That is, if you hit somebody on the head with a hammer and they happen to have a thin skull and they suffer brain damage where somebody with a thick skull would not have, you're still on the hook for all the damage. So that's the notion of thin skull. And so what Charles is saying is if kids with a genetic predisposition are the equivalent of a thin-skulled plaintiff, and then you superimpose on that some sort of a hypoxic stress that causes autism, then you have a case. I think we're there. What I caution against is to suggest we're not there. So the fact that there isn't definitive literature that proves based on a 95% confidence interval that there's a causal connection between birth trauma and autism doesn't mean you can't make that connection in one of your cases. And we'll probably never have that research because you can't design a study that can tease that out definitively based on a scientific standard of proof. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There are many things in obstetrics where we don't have direct proof. And obstetrics is a little different than other areas of medicine. The reason is this. We have limited ways in which to assess the fetus in utero, very limited ways to assess the fetus, primarily the fetal heart rate, which I've already talked about, but very limited ways. The way we know whether or establish whether a fetus is injured in labor is based on pulling together pieces of a puzzle from antenatal information, from intrapartum information, from neonatal information, and imaging of the brain. And we pull all of these pieces of the puzzle together, not any one of which definitively establishes when injury occurred. And then we infer from those factors whether or not brain injury occurred at or near the time of birth. But you need all of those pieces of the puzzle to fit together perfectly in order to establish that. And then we ask a second question. It may suggest that injury occurred at around the time of birth, but we still have to ask, is there any other more likely explanation for the injury suffered by this baby other than that one? And that's when genetics comes into play, because the defense is going to say, well, genetics is going to trump that. If there was an absolute genetic predisposition, it didn't matter what happened during labor and delivery. That baby was destined to have cerebral palsy, say, as an example. But with respect to what you're asking, which is a very good question, Charles, I think we're there. I think we can do no more when we act for these kids than to pull together what we have in a way that will allow the trial judge or a jury, if we have a jury, to make the causal connection.
Just one follow-up to that. So, you know, for cerebral palsy cases, you say once they get genetically tested, if that's a cause, we don't do it. But why can't you extend that thin skull rule to say it's just a cause, but it's the perinatal asphyxiation?
Oh, we do.
So you keep the case even though the genetics
Well, it
is
depends.
just a cause?
Yeah, so it depends on the strength of the connection between the genetic testing and the cerebral palsy. And not to get into too much detail, but the reason why we might reject a case where there is a reasonable genetic explanation for cerebral palsy is because we may be missing certain reliable indicia of a peripartum injury. So for example, some of these kids, sometimes we see, you know, after the baby's born, we take cord gases and we look to see what the baby's oxygen from the umbilical cord, and you analyze the oxygen and the carbon dioxide in the cord to determine what the baby's oxygenation was at the time of birth. Sometimes they don't match with what we say happened. So we may get normal cord gases in some of these cases, which does not rule out a peripartum injury, but is discordant with what happened. Or, you know, most kids who suffer severe asphyxia will have a moderate to severe neonatal encephalopathy when they're born. They'll be very depressed. And some of our little clients have a mild encephalopathy. So it points potentially to other causes. So it's a bit of a gray area. See, if we have a case where you have a term baby, well-grown, tracing normal at the beginning, tracing really bad at the end, abnormal imaging, depressed baby, poor APGARs, seizures in the first 6 or 8 hours of life, I have nothing that's discordant there. But if I'm missing 1 or 2 of those factors, then I know the defense is going to raise some other issue, some other cause. And that's when genetics may be a more prominent issue. So I hope that answers that. Anybody else? Yeah, over there.
Thank you so much for this talk, and I thought it was very interesting data, and I think that your knowledge is definitely appreciated here. And this is far from my area of expertise, but you mentioned the study with regards to C-sections and how there is some sort of correlation between C-section and autism, which makes sense. Have you encountered any literature with regards to a control group being moms who have had elective C-sections versus the group where they've had to have emergency C-section, and whether there's any correlation to autism in both groups?
So that's an interesting question. First, there's no literature on that I've encountered, but there's undoubtedly been a population of women who have undergone C-section, non-emergent C-section, elective C-section, who have babies with autism. And then there's another population of women who have undergone emergency C-section for intrapartum fetal indications who have kids with autism. And I would absolutely bet that the proportion of kids with autism following emergent C-section would have a larger percentage of kids with brain lesions than the kids who went through elective C-section, also with a diagnosis of autism. So elective C-section, autism, no birth trauma, probably no brain lesions. Emergent C-section for fetal indications. When I say fetal indications, usually heart rate. So emergent C-section for fetal indications. Autism, white matter injury, autism due to birth asphyxia, almost certainly. Does that make sense? Is that? There are no studies that have compared that, none. Because there is no relationship, as I said earlier, between C-section and autism. There can't be no relationship between elective C-section and autism. The relationship must be because C-section is emergent for fetal indications that cause autism. That's the only logical explanation. Anybody else? Yeah.
Causal relationship to from a hypoxic event to autistic manifestations. Is it the degree to which they have suffered an hypoxic event with diffuse axonal injury? And it is the degree to which they are manifesting autistic-like behaviors.
So degree is
Would you see?
yeah.
Would you make that causal relationship?
I would, subject to
Okay.
one qualification.
Okay.
And the qualification is that you do not know the pre-existing vulnerability of a particular baby. So for example, preemies are far more susceptible to hypoxic injury than term babies by virtue of complications that arise out of prematurity. Immature lungs is an example. These babies may have respiratory issues. So I would say, or poorly grown babies, or babies who come from a dysfunctional placenta, right? These babies, so it's a bit nuanced, Diane. I think that the degree, if we were to match well-grown term babies who go through similar stresses during labor, I think we can make that connection, or different stresses during labor. But once we deal with gestational age, once we deal with growth, once we deal with placental issues, I think the answer changes.
Okay, and you said that there was definitely an increase with the diagnosis of autism. Have you ever entertained the idea that it might be something that is delivered in our environment, that an environmental factor that contributes to the diagnosis?
Yes, so
Okay.
there is literature that suggests that environmental factors also play a role.
Okay, I have
Yes.
lots more questions, maybe.
Anybody else? All right, well, thank you for indulging me.
Thank you, Richard. Very, very interesting stuff. Very complicated, as you know. That's what I mentioned at the beginning. Some of the ways that we stay organized is by using legal technology. I'm going to be talking about that after the lunch break. Just before our lunch break, I'm going to have Daniel come up from Filevine. We've been using Filevine since 2018 to stay organized. They've now got all sorts of artificial intelligence solutions built into their platform. They don't just serve law firms, they actually serve all sorts of organizations, so many of your organizations could benefit from platforms set up by Filevine. So I'll let Daniel tell you a bit more about it. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, first and foremost, good afternoon. And a special thanks to Mr. Gluckstein here for having us all out here and putting this on. It's a privilege to be here among all of you. My name's Daniel, obviously, as he said. I work with Filevine. We have a pretty strong mission and goal, and it's pretty simple but powerful. It's to give legal professionals more time to focus on what matters most, which is your clients, right? Medical malpractice and also personal injury work is some of the most complex and emotionally charged litigation there is. You're managing massive volumes of medical records, multiple expert witnesses, intricate timelines that can span years. And the reality is inefficiency doesn't just cost time, it can impact case outcomes, and client satisfaction. And that's exactly where Filevine comes in. Filevine is a legal operating core. It's a centralized and cloud-based system that manages complex, or every aspect of your case from intake all the way to resolution. Our platform is designed specifically for complex litigation with deep customization that lets you model your workflows exactly the way your specific firm operates. With Filevine's case management system, your team can centralize all of your case documents, medical records, and correspondence in one secure, searchable place. Automate critical tasks like deadlines, follow-ups, and expert coordination, ensuring nothing slips through the cracks. And track case progress, productivity, and outcomes through real-life dashboards that can help align with partners and your teams aligned as well. What really sets Filevine apart, though, is why Charles brought us here today, which is our AI solution. We are leveraging AI to make legal work faster, smarter, and more human-centered. Our AI platform, known as Filevine AI, is seamlessly integrated into your workflow. It can read and summarize thousands of pages of your medical records, medical documents, billings, providers, anything of the sorts in a matter of minutes instead of hours, helping lawyers quickly identify key facts, treatment timelines, and inconsistencies. We can also draft your demand letters, discovery responses, intake summaries using your firm's own tone and templates. So imagine having your actual verbiage, tonality, structures from your own demand packages in your writing style, and our AI will actually optimize and write just like you yourself are writing the demand. This will give your team a head start while maintaining your unique voice. Extract key data from unstructured documents like physician reports, billing records, transcripts, police reports, et cetera. Any type of document, we can build custom prompting for you and your firm specifically. This can also help populate your case fields automatically within your case management system too, saving a ton of time. This isn't about replacing lawyers, it's about removing friction so you can focus on your strategy, analysis, and advocacy, the things only a human can do. For medical malpractice and personal injury firms specifically, Filevine helps transform the burden of complexity into competitive advantages. Imagine being able to, again, automatically organize and link thousands of medical exhibits, use AI to surface relevant precedent and expert history, and generate chronologies and summaries in minutes instead of hours. We've seen firms reduce administrative time by up to 67%, freeing their most talented professionals to spend that time building cases, serving clients, and achieving better outcomes. At Filevine, we believe the future of the law isn't just working harder, but working smarter, of course. It's about combining powerful case management with ethical, responsible AI, and we're helping firms like yours deliver excellence at scale. Thank you again. We do have a little spot out there in the back. We'd love to work with a lot of you. Come ask some questions. We can even show you a live demonstration out there and walk you through the platform too. But one thing I did want to note is we're not just also medical malpractice and personal injury. Whatever your area of practice is, we can actually optimize and build out templates specifically for you. But thank you so much. I appreciate it.